In 1902, a mill worker's wife in North Carolina fed her family of 9 on cornmeal that cost 8 cents a pound. Nobody went to bed hungry. Today, most Americans think cornbread is a side dish. It used to be the whole dinner. Number 7 on this list kept families alive through the Depression. Number 3 sat on Southern tables 6 nights a week. And number 1, our grandmothers made without a recipe because everyone already knew. Let's count down the 25 forgotten poor man cornmeal dinners our grandmas swore by. Number 25, cornmeal mush. This is where it all started. When the flour ran out, when the meat was gone, when the only thing left in the pantry was that 50-pound sack of cornmeal, your grandmother reached for a pot and a wooden spoon. She would bring water to a boil, salt it, then rain the cornmeal in slowly with one hand while she stirred with the other, because the second you stopped stirring, it lumped. 20 minutes of that, and the whole thing thickened into a hot golden porridge that stuck to your ribs and held off hunger until morning. A drizzle of molasses or a spoonful of bacon grease was all the flavor it needed. In Appalachia, they called it mush. In the Dutch farm country of Pennsylvania, they called it pap. Cornmeal cost pennies a pound, water was free, and a single pot fed 6 children on a cold night. It was the floor of the American kitchen, the meal that appeared when there was nothing else, and for millions of families, that was often enough. Number 24, fried mush. Nothing got thrown out in a poor kitchen, and cold mush was too good to waste. Your grandmother poured last night's leftover mush into a bread pan and set it in the cold room overnight, where it firmed up into a solid loaf. In the morning, she'd turn it out, slice it a ½ inch thick, and lay those slabs in a screaming hot skillet slick with bacon grease. The edges crisped into a deep golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, and the smell of it frying pulled children out of bed faster than any alarm clock. Served with sorghum syrup poured over the top, or a fried egg on the side, fried mush turned yesterday's poverty supper into today's breakfast. It cost nothing but a little grease. Farm families across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky ate it 3 mornings a week, and old-timers still get a look in their eye when you mention it. Number 23, hoe cakes. Legend says field hands cooked these on the flat blade of a hoe held over the fire, and whether that's true or not, the name stuck. Hoe cakes were the simplest hot bread a person could make. Cornmeal, salt, a little hot water or buttermilk, stirred into a thick batter and dropped by the spoonful onto a greased cast iron griddle. They spread out flat, crisped brown and lacy at the edges and came off the fire in about 4 minutes. Your grandmother made a stack of them to go alongside a pot of beans or a mess of greens, and any that were left got eaten cold the next day with butter and syrup. A hoe cake asked for no eggs, no milk, no leavening, and no oven. It could be made over a campfire, a wood stove, or a single gas burner, which is exactly why it survived slavery, the frontier, and the Depression. Cheap, fast, and filling, it fed the American South for 200 years. Number 22, corn dodgers. Firmer and denser than a hoe cake, a corn dodger was a hand-shaped cornmeal cake meant to travel. Your grandmother mixed cornmeal, salt, and just enough boiling water to make a stiff dough, then patted it into small oval cakes between her palms, and either fried them hard in grease or baked them on a hot stone near the fire. They came out heavy, golden, and dense enough to survive a whole day in a coat pocket. Men carried corn dodgers into the fields and the coal mines the way we carry a granola bar now, gnawing on cold ones between shifts because they held together and they held off hunger. Soaked in bean liquor or pot liquor, a hard dodger softened into something almost tender. A single sack of meal made Dodgers for weeks. It wasn't fancy, and it was never meant to be. It was fuel for people who worked with their hands. Number 21. Ash cakes. This one goes back further than any store or stove. When a family had nothing but cornmeal, salt, and a fireplace, your great-great-grandmother made ash cakes. She'd mix a stiff dough, wrap each cake in a cabbage leaf or a corn shuck, and bury it right in the hot ashes and embers at the edge of the hearth. 20 or 30 minutes later, she'd rake it out, brush off the ash, and unwrap a hot, dense little bread with a smoky flavor no oven could ever give it. Ash cakes cost nothing but the meal itself, and they required not a single piece of equipment, not even a pan. This was the bread of the poorest cabins in Appalachia and the rural South, the bread of people who cooked over an open fire long after the rest of the country had stoves. Grandmothers made them into the 1930s in hollows, where money and electricity still hadn't arrived. Number 20. Hush puppies. The story goes that Southern cooks frying up catfish would drop spoonfuls of leftover cornmeal batter into the hot grease and toss the fried nuggets to the yard dogs to hush the puppies. Whatever the truth, they became a meal in their own right. Your grandmother stirred cornmeal, a little flour, chopped onion, salt, and buttermilk into a thick batter, then dropped it by the spoonful into fat left over from frying fish. The puppies puffed up and rolled over, browning into crunchy golden balls with a soft, oniony center. On a Friday night with a plate of fried fish, or just eaten by the handful with a pot of beans, hush puppies stretched a little cornmeal into something that felt like a treat. The onion cost a nickel, the meal cost pennies, and the grease was already in the pan. Nothing wasted, everybody fed, and the dogs got the ones that hit the floor. Number 19. Spoon bread. Here was the fancy end of poor cooking, the dish your grandmother made when the preacher came to Sunday dinner. Spoon bread was cornmeal cooked soft, then lightened with egg and a little milk and baked until it rose like a soufflé, puffed and golden on top and so tender you couldn't slice it. You served it with a spoon, right out of the dish, and it fell apart into a warm, custardy cloud somewhere between cornbread and pudding. A pat of butter melting down into it was pure luxury. Spoon bread turned the humblest ingredient in the house into something soft enough for the oldest grandmother with no teeth and elegant enough to set in front of company. It cost maybe 15 cents to make and looked like effort you couldn't afford. Virginia and Kentucky cooks guarded their spoon bread recipes like heirlooms, and today you'll barely find it outside of a handful of old country restaurants that still remember. First pattern break. Here is what almost nobody understands about cornmeal. It fed America not because it was good, but because it was cheap. And it was everywhere. Corn grew where wheat wouldn't. It grew in poor soil, in thin mountain dirt, in the sun-baked bottoms of the Deep South. A farmer could raise it, dry it, and grind it himself at the local mill for a fraction of what wheat flour cost at the store. Through the whole first half of the 20th century, cornmeal ran 8 to 10 cents a pound, while wheat flour cost 2 and 3 times that. When the paycheck vanished, when the crops failed, when the Depression swallowed the country whole, the families that survived were the ones who knew how to turn that cheap yellow meal into breakfast, dinner, and supper. Cornmeal wasn't a choice. It was the difference between eating and not eating, and our grandmothers made an entire cuisine out of it. Number 18. Kush. Not to be confused with the Cajun dish, plain old kush was what a Southern grandmother made from leftover cornbread. She'd crumble day-old cornbread into a hot, greased skillet, add a chopped onion and just enough water or broth to moisten it, and fry the whole thing, stirring until the bottom crisped and the onion went soft and sweet. Some cooks cracked an egg into it. Some added a little leftover sausage or bacon. What came out was a savory, skillet-fried cornbread hash that made a full supper out of scraps that would otherwise have gone stale. Cush cost nothing because it was built entirely from leftovers, and that was the whole point. In poor kitchens across Mississippi and Alabama, cornbread was baked in abundance precisely so there would be enough left over to make cush the next day. It was frugality turned into flavor, and it filled the table when the cupboard was nearly bare. Number 17, cornmeal dumplings. When a pot of beans or a mess of greens needed to feed more people than it honestly could, your grandmother reached for cornmeal dumplings. She'd mix cornmeal with a little flour, salt, and enough hot pot liquor to make a stiff dough, then pinch off small dumplings and drop them right into the simmering pot. They cooked in 15 minutes, swelling up firm and soaking in all the smoky, salty flavor of whatever they were floating in. Suddenly, a thin pot of beans became a thick, hearty stew that could feed 2 extra mouths. The dumplings added bulk and body for almost nothing, and they carried the flavor of the pork and the pot liquor right into the middle of every bite. Appalachian cooks made cornmeal dumplings with pinto beans, with turnip greens, with anything that left a flavorful broth behind. It was a way of making a little food go further, which was the entire art of poor cooking. Number 16, cornmeal gravy over biscuits. Everybody remembers sawmill gravy made with flour, but plenty of poor kitchens thickened their gravy with cornmeal instead, because that's what was in the house. Your grandmother started with a spoonful of bacon grease in the skillet, stirred in a handful of cornmeal until it toasted and smelled nutty, then poured in milk, or water if there was no milk, and stirred until it bubbled up into a thick, speckled gravy. Salt, plenty of black pepper, and it was done. Ladled over split biscuits or crumbled cornbread, it turned a few pennies of ingredients into a hot, filling supper that stuck with a working man through a long afternoon. The cornmeal gave it a coarse, rustic body that flour gravy never had. This was breakfast, and often it was supper too, in the mountain kitchens of Tennessee and West Virginia, where a jar of grease and a sack of meal were sometimes the only thing standing between a family and an empty plate. Number 15, tomato gravy over cornbread. When there was no meat and no milk, there were almost always tomatoes, put up in jars from the summer garden. Your grandmother heated bacon grease in a skillet, stirred in a spoonful of cornmeal or flour until it browned, then crushed a jar of home-canned tomatoes right into the pan with a splash of water. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes were too sharp, and it simmered down into a bright red gravy that tasted like the whole summer. Poured thick and steaming over hot wedges of skillet cornbread, it made a supper out of almost nothing. The acid of the tomatoes cut clean through the richness of the cornbread, and the whole plate cost maybe a dime. This was a meatless meal that nobody complained about, served on tables from Georgia to Arkansas on the nights when the smokehouse was empty and payday was still 3 days away. Number 14, cracklin' cornbread. Come hog killing time in the fall, when a family rendered lard from a slaughtered pig, they were left with cracklins, the crispy little bits of pork skin and fat that fried up in the process. Nothing got wasted, so those cracklins went straight into the cornbread. Your grandmother stirred a big handful into her cornbread batter and baked it in a screaming hot cast iron skillet until the top was dark and crackling. What came out was cornbread transformed, shot through with salty, crunchy nuggets of pork that made every bite taste like it had meat in it, because it did. A wedge of cracklin' cornbread and a glass of buttermilk was a full meal for a hungry field hand. It stretched the flavor of a single hog across weeks of suppers, turning scraps that most people today would throw away into the richest, most satisfying bread on the whole table. This was pure resourcefulness baked into a skillet. Number 13, cornmeal crusted fried catfish. For families that lived near a river or a farm pond, the fish were free, and the cornmeal turned them into a feast. Your grandmother cleaned the catfish, soaked the fillets in buttermilk, then dredged them heavy in seasoned cornmeal before dropping them into hot grease. The cornmeal crust fried up into a crunchy golden shell that sealed all the moisture inside, and the fish came out flaky and clean-tasting under that coating. Nothing but the meal itself cost a dime because the catfish came from a line thrown off the bank on a Sunday afternoon. Served with hush puppies and a mess of beans, a plate of cornmeal fried catfish was the great equalizer of the poor South, a meal that felt like a celebration but cost almost nothing. Church fish fries, family reunions, and Friday night suppers all ran on it. That cornmeal crust is the reason a free fish tasted like the best thing you ate all week. Second pattern break. Now here is something our grandmothers never knew, and it very nearly killed them. Through the early 1900s, a mysterious disease called pellagra swept through the corn-eating South, causing rashes, dementia, and tens of thousands of deaths. Doctors blamed everything from germs to bad hygiene. The truth was hiding in the cornmeal itself. Corn contains niacin, an essential vitamin, but it's locked in a form the human body can't absorb unless the corn is treated with lime the way Mexican cultures had done for centuries to make hominy and tortillas. Southern families ate their corn ground raw into meal, so they got the calories but not the vitamin. It wasn't until the 1930s that scientists finally cracked it. The families who paired their cornbread with beans, greens, and a little pork were unknowingly saving themselves because those foods carried the niacin the corn couldn't. Our grandmothers were doing the right thing by pure instinct long before anyone could explain why. If you want to actually cook these forgotten recipes in your own kitchen, you can grab our cookbook bundles on our website. Just pause to scan the QR code on your screen or tap the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Now, back to the countdown. Number 12, Indian pudding. Up in New England, cornmeal made dessert. Indian pudding was one of the oldest sweets in America, dating back to the colonists who learned to cook with Indian meal because wheat was scarce. Your great-grandmother slowly cooked cornmeal in milk until it thickened, then sweetened it with dark molasses and spiced it with cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg before baking it low and slow for hours. What came out was a dark, dense, spoonable pudding, deeply sweet and warming, the color of wet earth and the texture of soft custard. Served warm with a splash of cream or a scoop of ice cream if the family could manage it, Indian pudding turned 3 cheap pantry staples into a proper Sunday dessert. It cost almost nothing, and it filled a whole house with the smell of molasses and spice on a cold winter afternoon. Colonial taverns served it, farm families lived on it, and today almost no one under 70 has ever tasted it. Number 11, polenta. When Italian immigrants poured into the cities of the Northeast in the early 1900s, they brought a cornmeal dish that was pure survival food back home, polenta. It was the same humble idea as Southern mush, cornmeal slowly stirred into boiling salted water, but the Italian grandmothers treated it like an art. They stirred it patiently for 45 minutes until it turned silky and thick, then poured it out onto a wooden board where the whole family ate from the same spread, topped with a little tomato sauce or just cheese and a scrape of drippings when times were hard. Cold leftover polenta got sliced and fried the next day, crisp on the outside and creamy within. In the tenements of New York and the mill towns of New England, polenta fed enormous families on pennies a person. It was peasant food in the truest sense, the same cheap yellow meal the South was eating, dressed in a different accent. Number 10. Kush Kush. Down in the bayou country of Louisiana, Cajun grandmothers made kush kush, and every child raised in that part of the world remembers it. She'd pour cornmeal, salt, and a little water into a heavy cast iron pot with hot grease, then cook it, stirring and scraping until the bottom formed a dark crust that she broke up and folded back through, over and over, until the whole pot was a mix of soft crumbles and crispy browned bits. Then it went into a bowl and got drowned in warm milk or covered in cane syrup and eaten like a hot cereal. Kush Kush was breakfast for poor Cajun families for generations, cheap enough to feed a house full of children before dawn and hearty enough to keep them going until noon. It cost almost nothing, it used one pot, and it tasted like childhood to anyone who grew up on it. Outside of Acadiana, hardly anyone even knows the name anymore. Number 9. Cornmeal fried green tomatoes. At the end of the growing season, when the frost was coming and the tomatoes on the vine would never ripen, nothing got wasted. Your grandmother picked the hard green tomatoes, sliced them thick, dredged them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in a hot skillet until the coating turned crisp and golden. The cornmeal crust crackled against the tart, firm tomato inside, tangy and crunchy all at once. A platter of fried green tomatoes could be the centerpiece of a summer supper, served with nothing more than a slice of cornbread and a glass of buttermilk. The whole meal came out of the garden and the meal sack, and it cost practically nothing. This was the taste of thrift, of a family that refused to let a single green tomato rot on the vine when a little cornmeal and grease could turn it into supper. It fed the rural South for a century before a movie made the name famous, and the dish itself faded from home kitchens. Number 8. Supon. Long before the Midwest was settled, the Dutch farmers of the Hudson Valley were making supon, their name for cornmeal mush, cooked thick and rich. They took the same basic porridge and treated it as a proper family meal, cooking it slow in milk until it was creamy, then serving it hot in bowls with butter, molasses, or maple syrup poured over the top. Cold supon was sliced and fried the next morning, just like Southern fried mush. This was the everyday supper of Dutch and German farm families across New York and Pennsylvania for 200 years, a warm and filling meal that a grandmother could stretch across a whole table of grandchildren for the cost of a little meal and milk. The word itself came from the Native Americans, who first taught the settlers to cook corn this way. It is one of the oldest continuously cooked dishes in America, and it has all but vanished from the modern table. Number 7. Fried grits cakes. In the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, grits were the morning ritual and nothing got poured out. Whatever grits were left in the pot got scraped into a dish and set to cool, where they firmed up into a solid block overnight. The next day, your grandmother sliced that block into thick squares, dredged them in a little dry cornmeal, and fried them crisp in bacon grease. The outside turned into a crackling golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, and a fried grits cake with a fried egg on top and a little syrup on the side was a breakfast fit for a king that cost about a nickel. This was the meal that made sure not a single spoonful of yesterday's grits ever hit the trash. Poor families in the coastal South lived by this rhythm, cooking a big pot of grits, knowing the leftovers would feed them again tomorrow in a whole new form. It was frugality as reflex, passed down so quietly Nobody even thought to write it down. Third, pattern break. Here is what we really lost when we walked away from these meals. It wasn't just the recipes, it was a whole way of thinking about food. Our grandmothers looked at a 50-pound sack of cornmeal and saw 100 different dinners. They saw mush and dumplings and cornbread and dodgers and gravy, breakfast and supper and dessert, all from one cheap bag. Nothing was single use. Nothing was too humble. Leftovers weren't a burden. They were tomorrow's meal already half made. That kind of resourcefulness came from necessity, from generations of people who could not afford to waste a crumb and so learned to make every crumb count. When the supermarkets filled up and the money came in, we didn't just stop making these dishes. We stopped needing the knowledge behind them. And a way of feeding a family on almost nothing, wisdom earned across 100 hard years, quietly disappeared in a single generation. Number 6, scrapple. When Pennsylvania Dutch farmers slaughtered a hog in the fall, they refused to wash even the scraps, and scrapple was the proof. They simmered the odd bits of pork, the trimmings and the bones, until the meat fell apart, then thickened that rich broth with cornmeal and buckwheat flour, seasoned it with sage and pepper, and poured it into loaf pans to set firm overnight. The next morning, your grandmother sliced the loaf a 1/4 inch thick and fried the pieces in a hot skillet until each side turned deep mahogany brown and crisp. Served with a fried egg and a drizzle of syrup or a spoonful of apple butter, scrapple launched working men into the fields and factories on cold mornings. A single loaf cost pennies and lasted a week. It took the cheapest, most overlooked parts of a hog, bound them together with cornmeal, and turned them into breakfast. Outside a few counties in Pennsylvania, almost no one makes it anymore. Number 5, cornmeal griddle cakes. Long before boxed pancake mix, poor families flipped cornmeal griddle cakes for supper as often as for breakfast. Your grandmother mixed cornmeal with a little flour, an egg if the hens were laying, buttermilk, and a pinch of soda, then ladled the batter onto a hot greased griddle where it spread into thin cakes, crisp and lacy at the edges. Stacked high and drowned in sorghum or cane syrup, cornmeal griddle cakes made a hot, filling meal out of almost nothing, sweet enough to feel like a treat, and cheap enough to make any night of the week. On farms where a jug of homemade syrup sat on the table year-round, this was a supper the children begged for. The cornmeal gave them a coarse, hearty texture that no fluffy modern pancake can match. It filled bellies, it used what was on hand, and it cost so little that even the poorest kitchen could serve it up when the children were hungry and there was nothing else to give them. Number 4, corn pone. Corn pone is cornbread stripped down to its barest bones, cornmeal, salt, water, and grease. No eggs, no milk, no sugar, no leavening. Your grandmother mixed a stiff dough, shaped it into oval cakes with her hands, and either baked them or fried them in a skillet slick with bacon fat until they formed a hard, crunchy crust around a dense center. This was the bread of the very poorest kitchens, the bread that could be made when there was nothing in the house but the meal itself. It was the daily bread of enslaved people, of frontier settlers, of Depression-era sharecroppers, the plainest possible way to turn corn into food. Eaten with a bowl of beans, crumbled into pot liquor, or gnawed plain in the field, corn pone kept people alive through the hardest chapters of American history. It asked for nothing and gave everything. When a family had corn pone, they had bread, and when they had bread, they had a fighting chance. Number 3, cornbread dressing. Once a year at least, at Thanksgiving and Christmas, cornmeal became the heart of the feast. Your grandmother baked a big pan of cornbread days ahead just to let it go stale, then crumbled it into a bowl with torn biscuits, sautéed onion and celery, sage, and enough turkey or chicken broth to make it wet, and baked the whole thing until the top turned golden and the inside stayed soft and savory. Cornbread dressing was how a poor family made a holiday out of pennies, stretching a small bird across a big table by surrounding it with a pan of dressing that everyone loved more than the meat itself. The whole thing was built on cornbread that cost almost nothing, transformed by a little broth and a handful of herbs into the dish the whole family remembered all year. It was the one time the humblest ingredient in the house got to be the star, and in millions of Southern kitchens, it still is. Number 2, beans and cornbread. This is the meal that built the American working class, one bowl at a time. A pot of dried pinto or navy beans, soaked overnight and simmered all day with a piece of salt pork or a ham bone and a hot skillet of cornbread baked while the beans cooked down. You crumbled the cornbread right into the beans, or you dragged it through the thick, smoky bean liquor until the bowl was clean. The beans gave you the protein, the cornbread gave you the bulk, and together they made a complete, nourishing meal for a family of 6 for less than a quarter. In the coal camps of Kentucky and West Virginia, in the mill towns and the farm country, this appeared on the supper table 5 and 6 nights a week. Nobody grew tired of it because there was nothing else, and truthfully, few things ever tasted better after a hard day's work. Beans and cornbread fed generations of Americans who asked for nothing fancy and got by on almost nothing at all. Number 1, cornbread and buttermilk. At the very top of this list is the humblest supper of them all, so plain that naming it almost feels like a letdown. A wedge of cold cornbread crumbled into a tall glass of cold buttermilk, eaten slowly with a spoon. That was dinner. In 1,000 farmhouses across the South and the mountains, on the nights when the money had run clean out and the week was not yet over, this is what appeared on the table. The cornbread soaked up the buttermilk and turned soft, tangy, and cool, and a working man swore it was the most satisfying thing he ate all week. It cost a dime. It required no cooking at all if the cornbread was already made, and it carried something no restaurant could ever sell: the memory of a grandmother who could feed her whole family on next to nothing and never once let them feel poor. This is the meal that appears in every oral history of hard times in America, and it's the one we should remember most. Here's my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The fried mush, the tomato gravy over cornbread, the beans and cornbread, or the cold cornbread and buttermilk that our grandmothers lived on. Then come back and tell me if it was as plain as you expected, because I tried it, and my grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. Drop the one you're going to make in the comments. These weren't just cheap dinners. They were proof that a sack of cornmeal and a little know-how could carry a whole family through the hardest years. And that's a kind of richness we forgot we ever had.